I wasn't even sure what I was looking at when she touched my shoulder. Not that it was deliberate, or maybe it was, in a way I couldn't pin down. I had been staring at the row of dusty manuals in the corner of the bookstore, pretending to read while my mind wandered somewhere else entirely. And then, a soft tap, barely noticeable, and a voice that carried calm authority, said, "You're looking at me the wrong way." I froze. My fingers still held the edge of a book, but the words didn't sink in. Not immediately. My gaze snapped up, and there she was, mid-40s, maybe older, the kind of woman who didn't need a spotlight to be noticed. She was leaning against the counter, one elbow propped casually, the other hand holding a worn leather journal. Her hair had that deliberate disarray that somehow suggested both recklessness and control. And her eyes, God, her eyes, were calculating, teasing, and maybe amused. I mumbled something incoherent, probably sorry, or I wasn't, but she didn't wait for me to finish. She tilted her head slightly, like she was listening to a question I hadn't asked yet. There was a confidence in her posture that made me feel smaller, even though I'd always thought I had decent self-awareness. We didn't speak for a long moment after that. The bookstore smelled faintly of coffee and paper dust, warm but a little too quiet for me. I realized my heart was doing that stupid little jump thing when someone notices you in a way that makes you question your own presence. She moved closer to the shelf I'd been standing by, picking up a paperback and flipping through it with one finger. Not looking at me, but aware of me. There was a pause that stretched longer than it should have. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but my mouth betrayed me with a dry, awkward laugh. She looked up then, suddenly, and our eyes collided. It wasn't flirty, not overtly, but it was weighty, like she could see through the flimsy walls I thought I'd built around myself. And maybe she liked what she saw, or maybe she didn't care enough to hide her judgment. She straightened, still holding the book, and her lips quirked upward ever so slightly. A gesture that said more than words could. And then she touched my shoulder again. Lightly, just for a second. Enough that the heat from her fingers lingered. Not a brush, not a warning, not a claim. Just acknowledgement. A quiet punctuation that made me realize I was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of her presence. She walked away before I could say anything coherent. Not in a hurry. No, she moved like she owned the floor, like she'd been here 1,000 times before, and I was the interruption, the spark she allowed herself to notice. And I watched, dumbstruck, as she disappeared down the aisle, leaving the faint scent of something earthy and warm behind her. I returned to the shelf, but the words on the page made no sense. My fingers itched to trace the spot where she'd touched me. My mind refused to leave that fleeting contact alone. And somehow, in the quiet between stacks of books and whispered footsteps, I knew I would remember that moment over and over. The weight of a touch, a glance that said more than any conversation could, and the subtle, impossible pull of someone I wasn't supposed to notice, but couldn't stop thinking about. And for reasons I couldn't articulate, I wanted her to touch me again. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. Not today, not ever. Yet there she was, perched on the edge of the worn leather chair in the repair shop, her legs crossed, eyes scanning a clipboard with that same practiced intensity. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, making the air smell like machine oil and old paper, but I didn't notice any of it. I was supposed to be helping her, moving a stack of manuals she insisted on keeping organized, but I found myself standing frozen for a second too long, watching the way her fingers traced the edge of the clipboard. Long, deliberate movements. Careful, like she was protecting something fragile she didn't trust anyone to see. "You need help with that?" I asked, finally, my voice softer than intended. She glanced up, one eyebrow raised. That subtle tilt of the head that made it impossible to tell if she was amused or irritated. "I've got it," she said, but her fingers lingered on the paper a moment longer, a small tremor in her grip. It was almost invisible, but my mind caught it. The faint shake betrayed a tension she didn't let anyone else see. I moved closer, pretending to adjust the stack of manuals. She didn't look at me, but the corner of her mouth twitched, the smallest acknowledgement of my presence. I noticed how tired her eyes looked, the faint shadow under them, like she'd been carrying something heavier than the day's work. "You've been here a long time," I ventured, more carefully this time. "Shouldn't you?" I hesitated. "Take a break." Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp, guarded. A flash of something, defiance? Fatigue, passed across her face before she masked it with that calm composure. "I can't. There's too much to do," she said. Her voice didn't waver, but her shoulders slumped just slightly, the way someone might shift under a weight that doesn't belong to them. I caught myself staring, memorizing small things. The line of her jaw as she chewed on her lip, the way her fingers flexed and curled around the pen, the subtle pause before she exhaled. Vulnerability, almost hidden beneath years of careful control. "You're overworking," I murmured, not expecting an answer. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she set the clipboard down, leaned back, and let her eyes close for a fraction of a second, just long enough to make me notice that she needed it. Then, abruptly, she opened them, and they were sharp again, unreadable, practiced. I wanted to reach out, to offer something I didn't have words for. I wanted to brush a strand of hair away from her face, tell her it was okay to rest, but I didn't. Instead, I just lingered near her side, careful not to intrude, letting the quiet hum of the shop fill the space between us. Then, without warning, she laughed. Quiet, almost shy, a soft exhale that wasn't meant to carry far. And in that sound, there was something raw, an invitation I wasn't supposed to take seriously and yet couldn't ignore. Her eyes met mine for just a moment, charged with unspoken tension. I felt it, slow, pulsing, magnetic. A warning and a welcome all at once. And as I reached for the manuals again, pretending to busy myself, I realized I couldn't stop noticing. The way her presence pulled at something in me I didn't have the right to, but couldn't resist. She shifted slightly, brushing her shoulder past mine. A small, almost accidental touch. And for a heartbeat, the air between us felt electric. The rain came suddenly, hammering against the tall windows of the workshop with a rhythm that made the room feel smaller, tighter. I was kneeling on the concrete floor, fiddling with a stubborn gear, when I realized she was standing close behind me, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the workbench. Close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off her, but not close enough to reach out without asking permission I didn't have. "You know," she said quietly, almost as if she were talking to herself, "sometimes I think these machines are easier to read than people." I froze, wrench in hand, not because I was startled, but because the sound of her voice, that soft, so unguarded, made my chest tighten. I didn't answer. I just listened, pretending to inspect the gear, stealing glances at the way her hair fell over her shoulder, the way her brow furrowed ever so slightly when she watched me work. She leaned closer, not touching me, but close enough that our shoulders brushed slightly. That moment, so ordinary, so accidental, made me aware of everything. The tension in her hands, the subtle scent of coffee on her sweater, the faint tremor in her laugh when she shook her head at something I muttered under my breath. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, then her face shifted, a fraction of hardness replacing the softness I had just seen. A name flashed across the screen, and I felt the pull of distance that wasn't physical but immediate and undeniable. "I need to take this," she murmured, stepping away and picking up the phone. Her voice held the same calm authority, but now there was an edge of tension that snapped the fragile intimacy between us like a brittle wire. I watched her walk toward the corner of the room, her posture straight, every movement deliberate. And for a second, the storm outside felt mirrored inside me. Sudden, chaotic, impossible to control. I wanted to say something, tell her not to go, or maybe just reach out and touch her shoulder the way she had touched mine the first day. But I didn't. I stayed kneeling on the floor, wrench in hand, pretending to focus on the machine. When she returned a few minutes later, the phone call ended. She leaned against the counter again. Our eyes met, briefly, dangerously, and something hovered between us. Something that felt like it could tip, like a word, a laugh, or a touch could cross an invisible line. She moved closer to the workbench again, almost brushing past me, and for a heartbeat, I thought she would. She would lean in, her hand on my arm, her lips close enough to say something that wasn't meant to be said aloud. But she didn't. She stepped around me instead, straightening her posture, her fingers brushing lightly across the edge of the metal surface, a deliberate, restrained motion. And just like that, the moment passed, leaving me kneeling there, heart thudding, aware that something unspoken had almost happened, something I both wanted and feared. I exhaled slowly, wrench forgotten in my hand, and realized I had been holding my breath the whole time. The storm rattled the windows, and I stayed still, aware that tonight, proximity had pulled us dangerously close to something neither of us was ready to name. The room smelled faintly of rain and old metal, a quiet residue from the storm outside. We sat across from each other on the low leather couch in the corner of the workshop, neither of us moving much. The hum of fluorescent lights above was the only thing filling the space, yet it sounded unbearably loud. "I don't understand," I said finally, my voice breaking the stillness, though it barely carried across the distance between us. "What are we doing?" She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in that way someone looks when they're trying to make sense of something that has no easy answer. Her fingers rested lightly on her knee, tapping a quiet rhythm against the leather. She didn't speak immediately, and the pause felt heavy, like a held breath that had been too long in the lungs. "I don't either," she said at last, her voice calm, almost brittle. "And maybe that's the problem." Her words settled over me like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat went dry, my mind fumbling for sentences that weren't there. I noticed every small thing about her. The way her hands curled slightly inward, the faint tremor when she shifted, the tired set of her shoulders that she tried so hard to disguise. She wasn't pretending anymore, not fully, not in the way I had started to pretend with myself. I feel like I stopped. I didn't even know what I was trying to say. Closer? Something forbidden? Or just alive in a way that scared me? The words dissolved before they left my mouth. She tilted her head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it spoke volumes. "I think we can't ignore it," she whispered, not meeting my eyes. "We can't just keep pretending this is normal, like nothing's happening." Her honesty made me flinch, not because it was shocking, but because it was true. It was undeniable, and yet we were standing on the edge of something neither of us had permission to cross. I swallowed, heart thudding, trying to steady my voice. "Then what do we do?" She finally looked at me then, and her eyes softened, though they still held a flicker of guardedness. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker. "I don't know," she admitted. And for the first time, she seemed human. Vulnerable in a way I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. We sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that doesn't demand words, because everything that could be said was already present in the tension between us. My chest ached, a dull, persistent throb. I wanted to lean in, ask her to explain, beg her to stay, but the fear of ruining everything held me back. Finally, she rose, moving toward the workbench with a deliberate slowness, leaving me there with the echo of her presence. Her hand brushed the edge of the counter, just a whisper of contact that lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. And then, before she left the room entirely, she glanced over her shoulder, and in that look, quiet, vulnerable, almost pleading, she said, "I don't think I can do this without breaking something, maybe us." The words landed like a stone in my chest, and I realized I had been holding my breath again, waiting for something to give. But there was nothing, just the ache, the silence, and the weight of all the things we couldn't say. I was stacking tools when she appeared in the doorway, a letter clutched loosely in her hand. Her eyes didn't meet mine at first. They were fixed somewhere beyond the room, somewhere private. The air felt heavier, as if it had been holding its breath for her to speak. I found this," she said finally, voice quiet, almost fragile. She extended the letter toward me, but didn't hand it over. I wasn't sure if I could. I stepped closer, careful not to crowd her, my fingers brushing against the edge of the counter. "You can show me," I said gently. "If you want." her and trembled just slightly as she unfolded the paper. I noticed it, the small quake, the hesitation, the way her lips pressed together as though holding in something she had been carrying for years. "It's from him," she murmured, almost to herself. "From someone I lost a long time ago." She glanced at me then, and her eyes were wet, shimmering with a vulnerability I had never seen. I thought I was done with it. I thought I'd buried it. I didn't speak. I just watched the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders sagged, the tight line of her jaw easing just a fraction. The silence was thick, but not oppressive. It was a space where something real could breathe. "I wasn't expecting this," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the paper. "I didn't expect it to bring everything back." I remembered the stories she had told, brief anecdotes about love lost, about mistakes that couldn't be undone. And suddenly, the half-smile she gave in the mornings, the way she avoided certain streets, the quiet moments where she seemed almost untouchable, it all made sense. "You're not alone," I said softly, more to steady myself than to offer advice. Even if it feels like it sometimes." She looked at me then, really looked, and the flicker in her eyes caught me off guard. Not desire, not exactly. Something deeper. Something like relief or recognition. "I don't usually let anyone see this side of me," she whispered, her voice catching. "I'm not sure I should even be letting you." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, though my chest ached with the weight of that promise. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless in itself, but it meant everything in the quiet of that moment. She exhaled slowly, folding the letter carefully, and for the first time, she didn't seem guarded. Just human, flawed, broken, alive. And in the way she let her hand hover near mine, without touching, without asking permission, something seismic happened inside me. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. But it was something far more dangerous. The beginning of trust, of intimacy, of unspoken understanding that neither of us could undo. I stayed where I was, heart hammering, watching her for the faintest sign of retreat, and when she finally turned, her eyes met mine again, just for a moment, with a quiet confession that didn't need words. She was letting me in a way no one else had. And in that single, suspended second, I knew everything had changed. The workshop was empty, the hum of the machines softened by the late hour. The storm had passed, leaving streaks of rain on the windows that caught the faint glow of the overhead lights. We sat side by side on the low leather couch, neither of us speaking, both of us pretending we were just tired, that the tension between us wasn't as sharp as it felt. I watched her hands, folded loosely in her lap. They were steady now, not trembling like before, but still carrying the quiet residue of everything she'd been holding on to, the losses, the fatigue, the walls she'd built brick by brick. I wanted to reach out, wanted to trace the faint scars of her history with my fingers, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let the silence stretch, letting it speak what words couldn't. She glanced at me once, just briefly, and in that look there was a subtle acknowledgement. Not of love, not aloud, but of something deeper. Understanding. Recognition. The shared decision that whatever this was, it was inevitable now. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured finally, voice low, careful. We both know." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I felt the pull in my chest, the quiet collapse I hadn't expected, the sense that everything we'd been holding back was no longer ours to manage alone. Her hand moved slowly, almost unconsciously, and brushed against mine. Lightly, tentatively, just enough to let me feel it, to let her feel me. It wasn't a gesture of passion or claiming. It was something smaller, something infinitely more powerful, a touch that said, "I'm here. We're here. Together." We stayed like that for a long moment. Not talking, not needing to. I could hear her breathing, steady now, and mine felt like it had finally found its rhythm too. Outside, the last drops of rain slid down the glass, tiny streams that caught the light like fragile threads. She leaned her forehead against my shoulder, not pressing, not demanding, just resting. And I rested my cheek against the top of her head, careful, mindful, grounding myself in the reality of her presence. The world outside could crash and burn. In this quiet space, nothing else mattered. I felt her fingers flex against mine, and I let mine curl around hers, a loose grip, not possessive, just connective. The weight of everything we had avoided, every glance, every pause, every almost moment, settled into that single, fragile contact. I realized then that this wasn't about grand confessions or sweeping gestures. It wasn't about labels or expectations. It was about honesty, presence, and the quiet surrender of two people finally letting themselves exist in the same space without fear or pretense. And in that stillness, I understood, whatever this was, whatever it would become, it was ours. Earned, real, unavoidable. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The soft pulse of our shared heartbeat, the brush of our hands, the weight of our bodies leaning together. It said everything we couldn't yet put into words. Finally, she pulled back just enough to look at me, eyes glimmering with quiet certainty. I smiled, small, awkward, but truthful. And that was enough. Looking back now, it feels strange to remember the moments before everything shifted. I can see it clearly, though. The hesitations, the pauses, the silences that spoke louder than anything either of us dared to say. At the time, it was confusing, frustrating, sometimes frightening. But now, I understand. She taught me, without meaning to, that love isn't always sudden fireworks or sweeping gestures. It can be quiet, almost imperceptible. It's in the spaces between words, in a hand that lingers just a second longer, in the acknowledgement that someone else's scars don't make them less worthy of care, they make them human. I changed too. I learned patience, the kind that isn't about waiting, but about noticing. Noticing the subtle tilt of her head when she's unsure, the way her eyes soften when she trusts someone, the tremor in her hands when she carries memories she isn't ready to release. I learned that restraint can be its own form of intimacy, that understanding someone doesn't always require words. Sometimes it requires presence. And she changed, I think. Not because I asked her to, not because I wanted her to. She allowed herself to be seen, to let someone in, even in the small ways, to share moments of weakness without fearing judgment. It was never dramatic or public. It was quiet, earned, and infinitely more profound for it. We discovered, together, that love isn't a destination. It's an accumulation of small, deliberate choices. The decision to stay, to notice, to acknowledge, to touch a hand lightly, or lean a forehead briefly against a shoulder. It's 1,000 micro-moments strung together, each one fragile, each one essential. And that's what makes it lasting, what makes it real. I think about the first day I saw her in the bookstore, the tap on my shoulder that sent my heart off balance. I think about the quiet, stormy nights, the shared silences, the letters, the laughter that came like a surprise after long tension. And I realized that every moment we almost faltered, every pause and hesitation, built the foundation for what exists now. A connection I never expected but can no longer imagine life without. It's not perfect. There are still moments of doubt, days when the weight of our histories presses in. But there's trust now, and awareness, and a shared sense of responsibility for each other's fragile edges. That, I think, is love, imperfect, grounded, and luminous in its subtlety. And I carry that with me. I carry her quiet courage, her vulnerability, her effortless strength. And I carry the awareness that real connection isn't always declared loudly. It's lived quietly, every day. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?